Good evening, everybody. I hope you all are doing well and are tuned in for the webinar, which is now starting in another 5 minutes, which is Feeding the World while Preserving the Ecosystem. And this webinar will be taken by Dr. Abhijit Banerjee. And let me just introduce you to Dr. Abhijit Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee has completed his MS and PhD in environmental policy from the US after his undergraduate in biological sciences from the University of Calcutta. He then served as an assistant professor of environmental studies at Northeastern Illinois University, Chicago for 6 years. Upon returning to India in 2013, he worked as Sustainable Development Specialist at the German Agency for International Development Cooperation, which is known as GIZ, at the United Nations in New Delhi. Since January 2019, he has joined in the School of Liberal Arts and Humanities as an associate professor in environmental studies at JGU. Welcome, Professor. Good evening. I hope you are doing well.
Yes, thank you, Nishi, for the introduction. Just before I begin, let me quickly test whether you can see my screen. Nishi, can you see the PowerPoint on the screen?
Yes, Professor, I can see that.
Okay, that means that the students can also see the PowerPoint on the screen. So I'll just go ahead and start.
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. Good evening to everyone who is listening. Nishi already gave my introduction. I'm a professor of environmental studies at the General School, JSLH, in the School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. You can see the starting screen of the PowerPoint. This is the topic for today. We will talk about what sustainable agriculture means, given our current context and challenges today. You see on the screen a few blocks listed at the bottom. Those represent the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have 17 Sustainable Development Goals accepted by the United Nations, and I listed these 6 because many of them are directly or indirectly related to agriculture, sustainable agriculture. Obviously hunger, obviously water, also biodiversity, climate. So many of our sustainable development goals are related to agriculture directly or indirectly. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. On the left, we see the rapid rise in global population starting from the 1950s. It also shows that in the developing world, the population growth was much faster. The developed countries in blue are, relatively stable population. The developing countries are rising rapidly. There was a lot of fear in the 1950s and 60s that the rapid growth in population in developing countries due to better healthcare and better, development opportunities would lead to a situation where food production will not be able to keep up, and as a result there would be large-scale hunger, famine, even conflict and war. So a huge effort was organized to try to scale up food production through research and through international cooperation, which led to what we all know as the Green Revolution. So we'll come to that in a moment in the next slide. The graph on the right, we see that as a result of the Green Revolution, total food production actually outpaced the growth in population. We see compared to the 1960s, population has grown about doubled by the end of the century, while food production has tripled. So it means that food production has increased faster than the population. Okay. So this whole thing is often referred to as the Green Revolution, the dramatic increase in food production globally, but particularly in developing countries, because the big concern was about developing countries, that developing countries would be not only become permanently dependent on food aid from the rich countries, but also there would be large-scale conflict and instability. However, developing countries, at least most developing countries, were able to dramatically increase food production through a lot of international aid, international research, collaboration and aid, which collectively known as the Green Revolution. This is something, the term Green Revolution, you're all familiar from high school. We've all studied about it in high school. What it ended up happening was the crux of the Green Revolution was dependent on high-yielding varieties of seeds, which were produced by hybridizing different types of traditional varieties. So for example, you have different types of rice in, let's say, India or Philippines or Vietnam. So you collect these traditional varieties and you cross hybridize them until you keep doing that, until you get a high yielding variety. So we see on the picture at the bottom is that the ones on the right are these high yielding variety hybrid plants, which produce much more grain. The plant itself is not so tall. More of the production is in the grain than the body of the plant. So each of these hybrid seeds could easily produce 2 to 3 times the amount of grain. However, they were heavily dependent on inputs. They were heavily dependent on irrigation water, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides. So all these together combined to produce the Green Revolution with a huge international effort. Dr. Norman Borlaug, shown on the right, he was one of the pioneering scientists during that time. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 due to his efforts and that of other scientists, which led to the complete avoidance of the negative impacts scientists were afraid of, that there would be large-scale famine and starvation and conflict. So that was all avoided. So it was quite fitting that Dr. Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. So we see over time that food security has improved steadily across the world, all across the developing world. Even in the poorest regions, sub-Saharan Africa, you see the line in deep green at the top. We see compared to in the 30s, in the 30%, now it's less than 20%. South Asia also now a little more than 15%. So we see across the board, in most regions, food security has increased. This is the share of the population undernourished compared to several decades ago. However, hunger has not completely gone away, and hunger is still quite a lingering problem in many parts of the world. We see in this map, in the Global Hunger Index, we see a strong emphasis in Africa. The countries shaded in yellow and brown are the worst affected. You see South and Southeast Asia also, we see a significant prevalence of hunger. And you see India is one of those countries where maybe not as much as some African countries, but still quite alarming. Given the fact that this is particularly alarming, given the fact that India is considered one of the success stories of the Green Revolution. So what does that mean? That means that hunger has many other complex causes. It is not just dependent on food production, on raw volume of food production. Because India, as you saw, the classic case, one of the most successful examples of the Green Revolution, yet one of the countries with significant persistent hunger and undernourishment problems. So what are the other causes of hunger? Many complex causes. We can only touch on it very superficially today. Poverty, unemployment. If people are poor, they don't have income, they can't buy food. In rural areas, landlessness, landless peasants. At least if you have your own land, you may be poor, but you can at least grow your own food to some extent. But if you're a landless peasant, you don't have that access. Sometimes trade policies in the name of encouraging trade sometimes often end up worsening poverty and hunger. For example, a classic case is, for example, US wheat. Wheat exports, very cheap wheat from the US is exported to Mexico, and small Mexican farmers cannot compete with the cheap wheat from US, and they get wiped out. So those small farmers who get wiped out end up contributing to increased poverty and unemployment and increasing hunger. So we see sometimes trade and economic policies have strange unintended consequences which can increase poverty and hunger. Then we have public policies like social security payments, welfare payments, which can reduce poverty and hunger. Even in a country with a significant poor population, doesn't necessarily mean that people will suffer from hunger, because governments can provide these subsidy payments. India has some degree of social security payments. We have a public distribution system which provides subsidized food to people below the poverty line. Even rich countries like in Europe or in the US, they also have special subsidy payments for the poor and unemployed so that they can afford basic nutrition. So with strong public policies, we can avoid or reduce hunger regardless of the amount of food production. Finally, we have natural disasters and man-made conflict. Both can affect food production. conflict, civil war, obviously will affect normal food production, harvesting, and so on. Natural disasters, droughts, floods also obviously affect food production. This is particularly a concern as we go forward with climate change. That these types of natural disasters are becoming more frequent. So there's strong concern that increasingly in the future, unless we take strong action to address climate change, food production will be severely affected if we are not able to avert disastrous climate change. Now let's also discuss the limitations of the Green Revolution. We have talked about how successful it was in dramatically increasing production. However, as we have seen, it had a lot of unintended consequences, which only became apparent much later. In the 1960s, for example, people and our government leaders and scientists were so worried about starvation, large-scale starvation and famine, that their only priority was just to increase food production at any cost. And that really happened. That really was very successful. But now that we have achieved a higher food production, we are now in a position to look at the unintended consequences and see what are the trade-offs and problems created by the Green Revolution. Some of which you are already familiar with, I guess, during maybe in your high school. So let's look at it one by one. Let's spend a few minutes on that. First of all, obviously, as we discussed, that the Green Revolution successful crop varieties were very dependent on external inputs, which included water, which included fertilizers and pesticides. So without these extensive and expensive inputs, it would not be possible to have a high output. So these types of special hybrid seeds, if you look at the diagram on the right, we see that these special hybrid seeds are extremely sensitive. They are very high yielding, but only under a very limited set of conditions, under just the right factors. If you have right amount of fertilizer, if you have right amount of water, not too much, not too little, then they can produce much higher than the traditional varieties. In contrast, the traditional varieties shown in red, they produce a relatively stable amount over a much wider range. So under a range of suboptimal conditions, the traditional varieties can continue to produce relatively high levels. In contrast, the hybrid varieties of the Green Revolution, they only produce a lot, but only under very, very optimal conditions, a very narrow range of optimal conditions. So that also means that as we become dependent on the new hybrid varieties, because they have become so popular and government policies have made them popular, we have unintentionally lost many of the traditional varieties, except some which have been preserved in seed banks. So remember that ultimately our agricultural success depends on traditional varieties. We can hybridize them and create more useful varieties, but ultimately we depend on the traditional varieties. And if we stop cultivating them, if we lose out, then we will have nothing to fall back on. So this has been an unintended consequence. Because of the popularity of the high yielding varieties, there has been a significant loss of traditional varieties. Also, we have a range of ecological impacts. We will discuss that one by one in the next subsequent few slides. But finally, we are also left with the question that the gains that we have seen from the 1960s onwards, can we continue those gains in the decades ahead? We have changing conditions, we have climate change, we have water shortages. So under these conditions, can we really continue those gains? So this is a big question mark, which we shall discuss next. Let's look at the impacts. Let's spend some time on ecological impacts deriving from the Green Revolution type practices, large-scale irrigation, large-scale use of chemicals, and so on. So because of the high dependence on irrigation, agricultural water use has quickly become the single largest consumer of water in the world. Almost in every country, it is the single largest consumer of water. However, what worked in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, today we are living in a very different planet. Today we are staring at water shortages, whether it is surface water, lakes and rivers, whether it is groundwater. We know very well in India, the breadbasket of India, Punjab, is now suffering from depletion of groundwater levels. This whole success of agriculture was dependent heavily on pumping groundwater, and now groundwater is declining so fast that there's not enough left. So whether it is surface water or groundwater, the picture on the left shows a huge dam. We have created huge dams all over the world to supply water for agriculture. And because of climate change and other reasons, we see less and less water supply available. This huge dam is the water levels are starting to fall. So the kind of water supply we have been able to rely on in the past is no longer certain as we go forward. The map on the right shows projections of water shortages, water stress in different parts of the world. If current trends continue, if climate change continues to worsen, we see that already many countries are water stressed, and in a couple of decades from now, we see water stress becoming an almost universal feature of most countries of the world, even in rich countries. Not only do we see in Asia or Africa, but we also see notice Australia, notice US, even rich countries are severely affected by water stress. So in other words, we cannot rely on this heavy dependence on irrigation that we have relied on in the past. Another aspect of the success of modern agriculture is heavy use of chemical fertilizers like nitrogen fertilizers, potassium, phosphorus, and so on. Many of these fertilizers, first of all, they're derived from fossil fuels like oil and natural gas. So as we need to take action on climate change, we have to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. So obviously we can't rely on fossil fuels as much as we did in the past. That's the first point. Secondly, overuse of these chemical fertilizers has affected soil fertility. Soil, as you know, is a very complex, or almost it's called a complex organism. Many different living beings have, create many different reactions in it to create what we collectively call soil fertility. There are many thousands of processes: bacteria, fungus, earthworms. You're familiar with earthworms. All these microorganisms create insects. They create conditions of soil fertility. But if you ignore all that and overdose the soil with a chemical fertilizer to increase plant yields, yes, you will increase plant yields in the short term, but over the long term, your soil fertility will start to decline. So that is what has happened in many parts of the world. Also, all this extra fertilizer that you are using, whenever it rains, it gets washed off with the rainfall. It ends up in the rivers, and the rivers drain into the sea. So all this extra fertilizer leads to severe water pollution, creating dead zones. So this particular map on the right is the classic example, the best studied example in the US. The big agricultural region, Mississippi region in the US, is one of the most prosperous agricultural regions in the world. And huge amounts of fertilizer gets washed away through the Mississippi River system, ending up in the Gulf of Mexico, creating a huge dead zone. So imagine all the fisheries. Fisheries are a huge source of food, and they're completely destroyed in the Gulf of Mexico. So imagine the irony that to create one source of food, you are in fact effectively destroying another source of food somewhere else. Chemical pesticides, we all know that chemical pesticides are toxic. And starting from the 1960s, scientists started noticing the impacts, researching the impacts of chemical pesticides. The classic best-selling book in the 1960s, Silent Spring, by the scientist Rachel Carson in the US, that really created this movement, global movement against pesticides, toxic chemicals in general, and pesticides in particular. Indiscriminate use of pesticides. You see the picture of the plane spraying pesticides. This is in the US, for miles and miles of crops. In the picture on the left is like a typical farmer in India spraying pesticides without any protection and getting exposed. So we see indiscriminate use of pesticides not only harms directly the health of the agricultural workers, but all that toxic chemicals, they spread into the environment. And they enter the food chain, and they spread everywhere. They spread in the water. You see the deformities of the frogs, which live in the water caused by agricultural pesticides. They spread all through the food chain, from insects up to birds and reaching humans. So many different types of health problems are created by these pesticides. Many different species have starting to get extinct because of the indiscriminate use of pesticides. The big concern now, with time, as these concerns have been highlighted, certain types of the most harmful pesticides have been banned, at least in rich countries, but poor countries often still continue using them. But even when new pesticides are introduced, which seem safer in the beginning, only decades later, we start seeing that they also have very harmful effects. One class of pesticides, you see the news article in the middle, they are heavily linked to the collapse of bee populations. And bees, as you know, are important for pollination, which is very crucial for the successful agriculture. So we see the irony that to promote agriculture, we are using chemicals that is leading to collapse of bees, which will harm agriculture. So we see that our approach to agriculture is very short-sighted with these examples. Soil, of course, is central to successful agriculture, and unless you take care of soil fertility, your success of agriculture will not last over the long term. Soil degradation is a widespread problem all over the world, in rich countries, in poor countries. We see in many parts of India are shown in red here. Even in rich countries like the US, Australia, we see it's almost like a near universal problem. Soil degradation is caused by many factors, including poor farming practices, overgrazing, deforestation, loss of vegetation, and so on. And all these, they taken together, leads to effectively we are losing 1% of the world cropland every year. So just think about this statistic for a moment. We are faced with a growing population. We are faced with the need to grow more food, but we are losing 1% of the cropland every year just due to poor practices, just because of poor practices. So which means to maintain our food production, we have to bring land from somewhere else, whether that means destroying forests or wetlands or something else. So just by trying to reverse soil degradation, we can check a lot of this. So we can continue to use the land we have and not be dependent on trying to bring new land under cultivation if we reduce soil degradation. Finally, agriculture is also a major contributor to climate change, both directly and indirectly. So directly, we use, especially modern agriculture, we use all sorts of inputs, fertilizers, chemicals, water pumping. All these need energy. We use tractors and other machinery. So all these agriculture, water pumping needs electricity. But also think of the indirect uses. You have to clear land for agriculture. And when you destroy forests, you lose carbon. So when you combine all that, land use change, both the direct direct energy use from agriculture as well as the indirect forest destruction caused by agriculture, when you combine all that, it adds up to very significant levels of greenhouse emissions. So that total is more than the entire global transport sector combined. So very, very significant and shocking number. We tend to think of agriculture as a benign activity. When we think of pollution, we think of industries, we think of transportation. But if you pause and reflect on this figure for a moment, we'll see that agriculture and associated land use changes are such a significant contributor to climate change. Another practice that we have become very dependent on is the global transportation of food, particularly in rich countries. This example you see is from rich countries in Europe. We see we are flying tomatoes, from thousands of miles away, bananas from Jamaica, lamb from New Zealand, oranges from California, and so on. So these are everyday practices that have become entrenched. So obviously this has an impact. We are using enormous amounts of fuel to fly this food around the world, and that also has an impact on climate change. Even India is not a high-income country, so we don't see this much of dependence on food from all parts of the world. But even in India, we see increasingly food being shipped from one part of the country to another, when in previous generations, food was mostly locally produced. So in other words, to really think of sustainable agriculture, we also have to think about local agriculture, to reduce our reliance on long distance shipping, to try to do as much as within our own province, within our own state, reasonably within a reasonable distance. Dr. Swaminathan, M.S. Swaminathan, this is perhaps a name which is familiar to most of you. He has been awarded the Bharat Ratna. He is considered the father of the Indian Green Revolution. Just like Dr. Norman Borlaug, we saw in the introductory slide, you could say that Dr. Swaminathan is the Norman Borlaug of India. So he was one of the brains behind the success of the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s in India. However, even in later years, even he has acknowledged that the downsides of what we saw the successes of the Green Revolution, and he has this is famous quote that Green Revolution has only bought us some time. It is not a permanent solution. It has, yes, there was an emergency. We had to do certain things to increase food production. We had to do it, but there are huge downsides. We cannot continue on this path. We need something different. What he has this famous phrase, the evergreen revolution, whatever you call it, but we have to take a more sustainable path. We cannot continue with business as usual, what we used to do in the past. Another topic that that is making a lot of headlines these days, some of you may have already seen it, I thought it would be important to stress, is the impact of a meat-heavy diet, the overall in both the environmental and social impact of a meat-heavy diet. Notice that the graph on the left the map on the left shows countries with high meat consumption. You see the rich high-income countries, Europe, US, Australia, they have much higher levels of meat consumption than countries like India or poorer countries in Africa. So what is the problem with meat consumption? The problem is that to produce meat, you first need to produce crops, which then have to be fed to the cows or poultry or pigs or sheep, whatever. So now it's like a two-step process. That means you are wasting enormous amount of crops which could directly be fed to humans, and you're feeding them to cows or pigs or sheep, and you're producing a little meat. Every step of the way, we all know about the ecological law of the ecological pyramid, ecological transfer. So at every step, there's a huge loss. So if you start off with 100 kilograms of wheat, you will only get 10 kilograms of beef. Instead, if you had 100 kilograms of wheat, you could feed that directly to humans. So if you depend heavily on a meat-heavy diet, that means you'll be able to feed a lot less people. You're diverting most of your food production to feed animals. So you're losing a lot of resources in the process. At the same time, you're also introducing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. Since we are concerned about climate change is urgent. We are also very worried about emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from climate change. The graph on the left shows both the land use as well as the greenhouse gas emissions from meat production compared to other crops. So the green bars show land use and the yellow bars show greenhouse gas emissions. In both cases, we see that the last two are sheep, goat, and beef. So we see they are orders of magnitude higher than the other crops. So obviously we see these are sheep, goat, beef. These are types of meat production which we can ill afford under the circumstances that we have. We don't have the luxury of wasting so much land for pasture or to grow crops for these animals. We don't have the luxury of generating so much greenhouse gas emissions which are needed to grow this beef, lamb, and so on. You may have noticed this topic in the news recently, the huge and record wildfires in the Amazon, Brazilian Amazon rainforest in this year and last year. Record, we see much higher levels. Every year there's a little bit of forest fire in Amazon. Much of it is done deliberately by farmers to clear land for agriculture. But this year it was a much higher record, mainly because the current president of Brazil, he is not interested in environmental conservation. He just wants to promote agriculture and industry at the expense of the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. So the unfortunate irony is that we all know that the Brazilian Amazon is equivalent to what scientists call the lungs of the earth. They're such important forests that they absorb so much carbon dioxide. So they are crucial in our fight against climate change. Now, the biggest tragedy is that what are we destroying the Amazon for? It is not just to feed poor people. We're destroying the Amazon mainly for cattle ranches, clearing the forest to create cattle ranches and soybean for cattle feed. So we see that our dependence on meat in the rich countries is effectively driving the destruction of the Amazon forest. Finally, the final last aspect of our dependence on meat is the emergence of huge factory farms, where we don't rely on most of our meat comes from factory farms these days, where thousands of animals are cooped up in cages and sheds, and they cannot walk about or run about normally. The picture of a cow happily grazing in the farm, those days are gone. That is not how meat is produced anymore. This is how meat is produced under shocking conditions of inhuman cruelty, but also it leads to huge pollution. It leads to huge disease, which leads to huge overuse of antibiotics. if you use too much antibiotics, then when we eat those meat, the meat is laden with antibiotics. We inject hormones into these animals. When we eat the milk and we eat the meat, we are actually ingesting those hormones. Many diseases, many scientists fear that antibiotic resistance bacteria are developing from these practices, on these unsanitary practices in factory farms. And there's huge chance of creating global pandemic. And standing here today, we don't need to tell anyone about the importance of pandemic, the horrors of the pandemic right now. Remember, the horrors of the current pandemic actually started in a meat market. So we see the way we do our business with meat has enormous unintended consequences, which scientists have been predicting, but which we have been ignoring for all these years. We keep ignoring until something really bad happens. So bottom line, we are faced with a situation, if not similar to the 1960s, but we are faced with a situation, a relatively grave situation today, that the world population is growing. It has started to stabilize in many countries, but in many developing countries it is still growing. So the UN projects that by the middle of this century, we will reach almost 10 billion people. So that means we would need more food. Some estimates show that we would need at least 50% more food. So, but we have done this before. One could argue we have done this before. We have increased production 3 times in less than 20, 30 years. Why can't we do it again? The answer to that is that we are living under very different circumstances today. Where is all that water? How can you afford to use so much energy? Because we are, staring at climate change. We had expanded agricultural land by sacrificing forests. Can we sacrifice forests now? So today we are living in a very, very different world. The type of practices we engaged in the 1960s to expand food production, we will not be able to rely on them anymore. So, but we still need to meet this target without relying on those kind of practices. So how do we do that? If you quickly look at the land use, breakdown of land use in the world, we see that when you add cropland and pasture land, it's almost a third of the global land use. And forest is about a quarter. A lot of it is desert. We can't use it, whether it's a hot desert or a cold desert. So we see that these are the dominant land uses. So now this graph tells us several different things. One obvious response is that you can expand cropland into forests if you want to increase food. But remember that forests are our savior against climate change. So if we sacrifice forests, we are worsening climate change, and we all know that climate change is going to wipe out agriculture. So we can't really afford to sacrifice forests. In the name of providing food, if you sacrifice forests, climate change is going to come back and wipe out your food. Forests also provide water. Forests act as a sponge for water. So, and agriculture is also dependent on water. So if you sacrifice forests, your water is also gone. And of course, forests provide biodiversity. They're a home for biodiversity, which are important for ecological balance. So we see this dilemma that we have now, that we are faced with. Another obvious thing that comes out of this graph is that the huge amount of land devoted to pasture. Pasture is for growing meat. We know that we can try to reduce our meat dependence. If we can reduce our meat dependence, then we can recover some of this pasture land and convert that into cropland. So that is potentially one area where we can increase cropland if we want, only if we reduce our meat dependence. Some advocates of more technological solutions, they promote different high-tech solutions to the challenges that we are facing, including advanced equipment, advanced drones, sensors, advanced chemicals, including genetically modified crops. You have all heard about genetically modified crops. Even we have there's a lot of research on indoor farming in cities, vertical farming. You see the picture on the right. However, yes, there are some promising technologies, obviously, but the main problem here is that these are all very expensive technologies and they require very high inputs. So just like the innovative technologies of the Green Revolution, most of this will not be suitable for developing countries. The biggest food insecurity problems are in developing countries, the biggest poverty and hunger in developing countries. So high-tech and expensive solutions mostly will not work in developing countries. Besides, there's another whole controversy with genetically modified foods where many scientists feel that there's unknown risks in the future. So, for example, European countries have banned cultivation of genetically modified foods. US is the leading proponent of genetically modified foods, and they have widespread cultivation of genetically modified foods. But European countries have refused to go in that direction. There's also a concern that any kind of genetically modified food, or if you take these steps, you are becoming more and more dependent on large corporations, which will control your seed supply. Anytime you're dependent on expensive inputs, fertilizers, chemicals, seeds, then small farmers keep losing out. Remember that small farmers are the key to food security in the developing world. So anything that hurts small farmers will not be, successful in improving food security. So yes, in theory, certain types of wonder technologies may improve productivity in the US, but will that help in reducing poverty and hunger in Africa? That's not necessarily true. So important message is that the food gap that we saw in the previous slide, in this particular study that I shared with you, many studies they're all coming to the same conclusion, that a lot of that gap, even half of that gap, must be closed with a demand response, reducing demand. You cannot rely on a supply response alone, given the constraints that we are facing. How do we reduce demand? We can reduce demand in many ways. We already noted we can reduce meat consumption. Not meat, by we means richer countries, which are heavily dependent on, they have a very high meat heavy diet. We can further promote family planning. Family planning has already been successful in many developing countries, but it is not so successful in other developing countries. If we really promote family planning aggressively in the other developing countries, then we can bend the curve, so to speak. We will not end up with 10 billion people by 2050. We might end up with only 8 billion or 8.5 billion. That can make a huge difference. Also, one thing that is not so well understood is that out of the total food produced, a lot of it is wasted. It is either lost during storage because we don't have proper cold storage, or pests are eating it up or something, or it is wasted by thrown out in restaurants or hotels, or by end-use consumers who are so rich that they don't care about wasting a little bit food. So if 30% of our food that we produce is eventually wasted, imagine what that means. If you reduce that wastage, then you already have that food to feed the growing population. You don't need to produce so much more food. So that is also a very important lesson. Finally, in the last couple of decades, we have been producing a lot of biofuels in the name of taking action against climate change. We are starting to reduce use of petrol and diesel. We are using biodiesel. Where does biodiesel come from? It is made from crops. So in order to do something good, what we are effectively doing is we are channeling food crops to make fuels for cars. What that means is we are diverting a significant part of the food supply to fuels. We are effectively contributing to increasing hunger and poverty in the world. So in a world which has high levels of food insecurity, we cannot afford to divert food for fuel. In a perfect world, if all countries were rich like US and Canada and Europe, then we could divert some of our excess food production for fuels. But since there's so much hunger and food insecurity in the world, we cannot afford to do that. Final slide. Then what is the bottom line? What is the future of sustainable farming? Increasingly, experts are increasingly in agreement that the future of sustainable farming, the answer to meeting the challenges in the 21st century, is agroecology. What does it mean? It means that emphasizing the ecological balance in a farming community. So to try to improve using ecological principles, you improve soil fertility, not just chemical fertilizers, use organic manure to improve soil fertility. So main thing is soil fertility, preserve biodiversity, not miles and miles of row crops of the same crop. You have crop diversity, crop rotation. That leads to better biodiversity, that leads to better ecological balance, that leads to improved fertility. You have probably remember reading about crop rotation. practices in your high school. So all these practices, some of it is an excellent marriage of traditional practices and modern science. So it's not either or. So we have to rely on modern science, but only if we accept the realities of ecological limits. You cannot use modern science blindly and destroy the ecological balance. So use modern technologies and science with respect to the ecological balance. That is what agroecology means. So it is more than, you're familiar with the term organic farming. Agroecology is more than organic farming. Organic farming only means don't use chemicals, don't use genetically modified seeds. But agroecological farming is much more than organic farming. It talks about the entire ecological balance of the entire countryside, the farms and the surrounding countryside. So what is the advantage? The advantage is that the total output, if you compare agroecological system with a conventional system, yes, in a conventional field, you can produce enormous amounts of one crop, rice or wheat or corn, but nothing else. But in agroecological system, your total output of food would be much higher. Yes, if you're growing wheat, your wheat yield will be lower than this high input modern system. But your total output of food, which includes crops, fish, livestock, fruits, vegetables, everything, that will be overall will be more, and more importantly, you can sustain it over a long time. It's not a boom and bust. So this is ideal for taking a long-term view of sustainable agriculture. And the biggest advantage is that this is ideal for small holders, small farmers in the developing world who are key to food security. We saw that map, that the food insecurity is concentrated in developing countries and in rural areas of developing countries. So if you do something, if you promote policies which hurt small farmers, you're not going to improve food security. So to improve food security, the weakest link in the chain, the most important link in the chain is this smallholding farmers. And agroecological approaches, because they are not dependent on expensive inputs, because they are dependent on traditional practices, they are ideal for promoting the food security of smallholding farmers. So that is the end of the topic to the lecture webinar today. If you have any questions, but finally, I should probably conclude by saying that if you are really worried about food security, the most important thing that everyone should be worried about is taking action on climate change. Unless we reduce climate change to manageable levels, nothing is going to work. Whether high tech, low tech, organic farming, whatever you call it, nothing is going to work. If you have runaway climate change, all of this is going to collapse. I mean, not immediately, but in the decades ahead. So the first principle is to take action against climate change. If you do that, then the rest of the answer is agroecological farming. Okay. So now we can take questions. Thank you. Yes, we do have already. We have one question. I don't see the name of the person asking the question, but a very good question. So I cannot spell out the name because I don't see that. The question is that we talked about biofuels, that we are diverting crops to, instead of feeding people, we are diverting crops for making fuels. So the question is about second generation biofuels, what is known as second generation biofuels. So obviously the person asking this question is already has advanced knowledge of the topic. We did not go into that much detail. So the question is right. The question is are second generation biofuels sustainable? So what I just described to you was first generation biofuels, where you are directly diverting crops for making fuel, which is obviously not desirable in today's world. What second generation biofuel, what it means is that instead of diverting crops directly, you only rely on agricultural waste. You try to make fuel only with agricultural waste, which would have been wasted anyway. So yes, of course, that is a sustainable option. It is much harder. It's much harder scientifically. It is much harder to convert agricultural waste into usable fuel. but a lot of scientists are working on it. You could say that we are close to success in many countries. So yes, once second generation biofuels becomes a success, that will definitely be a much more sustainable solution than first generation biofuels, which directly divert food crops. Mixing organic farming and green revolution. Okay, I see another question. Again, I don't have the name of the person asking the question. The question is, okay, the question is that can we rely on a mix of organic farming and green revolution based technologies for a sustainable future? The answer is yes. Yes. So the way I presented it is, you could say, a very compressed and simplified presentation with which we had to fit in half an hour. So there are each of these subtopics that we covered. There are many nuances to it, and each of these we could expand your discussion. You can go in much more detail. So yes, there are certain green revolution approaches that can definitely be used. For example, the hybrid varieties. Hybrid varieties are essential for improved production, but we have been losing the traditional varieties. So we have to make an effort to again rediscover those traditional varieties, because they are our source. Without that, we cannot produce these high yielding super varieties. So we cannot ignore that part, the origin. So once we make a huge effort to bring back those traditional varieties, that is our raw material. Using that raw material, you use modern scientific ways to hybridize through plant breeding techniques and create the best solutions, not only for high yield. Now we are even more worried about drought resistance. For example, climate change is creating more and more droughts. So you increasingly need to create hybrids that not only produce more, but those who can withstand drought. So many traditional varieties are grown in arid regions. So you cannot afford to lose them. So you have to go to those regions. You have to collect those the traditional varieties from arid regions, and then through scientific breeding techniques, hopefully, if you are able to create varieties, that is what scientists are working on, to create a variety that is both yielding higher produce, but also being able to withstand drought. This is absolutely essential for success in the future. The key lesson to keep in mind is that not either or. The key lesson is, what are our ecological realities? What are our ecological constraints? You cannot escape ecological constraints. So yes, you can use modern technology, but you cannot escape the ecological constraints. So the right question is, what kinds of modern technology do we use, or what kind of traditional knowledge do we use which fits to our current ecological reality? So the question is not about either traditional or modern. You can use both, but you have to be governed by the ecological constraints. Okay. A third question, another interesting question. When we spoke about the impacts of the meat industry, shouldn't we also talk about the dairy industry, impacts of dairy? Yes, absolutely. I should have the more accurate way of saying is that the animal farming, not just meat. Maybe I should have used animal farming is a more accurate term than saying meat. So animal farming means both meat and dairy. So any kind of animal farming, as we saw, has higher impacts than a plant-based diet, because of the same reason, because you need to grow plants to feed the animals first. So that's a two-step process, and you're wasting resources. So dairy, meat, conceptually they're the same. Any kind of animal farming is more wasteful than a plant-based diet. Now, given that, there are some caveats. For example, if we rely on a traditional model of farming where cows are grazing in the open pasture, that means you're not growing crops using energy to feed them. that has a much less impact than if cows are locked up in the shed. We saw the picture, and you're growing crops somewhere else with a lot of inputs and energy, then you're feeding those cows these crops. So in traditional settings, a traditional dairy farm where cows are grazing has much less of an impact than a factory farm where cows are locked up. Same thing, it's whether it's cows or poultry or sheep or whatever it is. So yes, the impact of dairy is little lower than meat, other meat like beef, but much higher than vegetarian crops. Also, dairy or meat, even between these, you see difference between how they are produced, whether it's a low impact dairy or a high impact dairy, low impact meat versus high impact meat. Okay. We have another question. This is a much more difficult question. What is the first step India can take to carry out agroecology without harming farmers? I'm not sure what harming farmers means, but let me answer the question in a more general way, that what are the policies that India or any country should actually be taking to promote more agroecology. For example, some obvious things stand out. For example, we subsidize agricultural water pumping, free water for all farmers. So farmers pump water blindly. Even in arid regions, farmers are growing crops that are not suitable for arid regions. You should not be growing cotton in eastern Maharashtra. Cotton is a water thirsty crop. Why do they grow cotton in eastern Maharashtra? Because water is free. Electricity for pumping water is free. So all these unfair, you could say unfair, ecologically harmful subsidies, we could gradually remove them. Any country, not just India, we could gradually reduce them, and that automatically opens up incentives for farmers to move towards methods of farming or choice of crop that are more suitable for the climatic conditions. Also, in Europe, for example, they're perhaps the best examples for agroecological farming. Farmers are given direct payments based not on agricultural production. Remember, in many countries, farmers are given a price based on their crops. Europe has tried to move away from that system, where they pay farmers not only on the value of their crop, but also on the value of ecological services provided by the farm and the surrounding countryside. What do I mean by ecological services? Means natural services that come out of a healthy ecosystem. Things like clean water, for example. Things like soil fertility. Things like proliferation of birds and insects and butterflies and bees and so on. So the more ecologically intact your farm and the surrounding countryside is, you get a higher payment from the government, rather than just the volume. I'm producing 2,000 kilotons of wheat or 5,000 tons of wheat. So now that shifts the incentive for the farmer, because doing ecologically friendly practices, one could argue that it is an extra cost to the farmer. They're sacrificing something. So in order to make that up, in order to level the playing field, so to speak, Europe has pioneered this practice of paying farmers based on ecological practices rather than just the raw amount of the volume of agricultural produce. Next question, India. The next question is about population. About India's population. This is, yes, you could say a devilish question, wicked question. There's no easy answers. Any country, anytime you talk about population, it's a sensitive issue with no easy answers. India is the second biggest population in the world. As you know, within a decade, India is going to overtake China. Within a decade, India is going to be the most populous country. China has growth is stabilizing, but India is still growing. So what should we do? Actually, the time for taking action was way back in the past. To be honest, the time for seriously investing in family planning was way back in the past. But if you remember, you are probably, most of you are very young to remember, your parents' generation would remember that in the 1970s, under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, there was a very serious effort towards population control. The whole family planning project, everything was taken up during that time. However, that project got discredited, that effort got discredited because of very coercive practices and even forced sterilization campaigns was taken up. So, and that has happened in other countries as well. So because of that, population stabilization has become completely discredited, and no politician wants to touch that subject. It's extremely controversial. However, many countries have shown that you don't have to use coercive measures like forced sterilization and forced abortion to control population for long-term population stabilization. You could do it with non-coercive practices, many types of non-coercive practices. But you think of Kerala, for example. Kerala is a classic example. The Kerala model is celebrated all around the world, not just in India, with high levels of women's education, with high levels of public health clinics all across the state. Every village has public health clinic which meets the women's needs and child health needs and so on, and proper high levels of women's education. They have very quickly flattened their population growth and stabilized their population growth. So, and Kerala is certainly not the only example. Thailand, many other countries have done that. So, so in some Indian states, we are well on our way to population stabilization. So that's not the problem. The problem is that there are a few problem states which have not invested, for a variety of reasons. They have not invested in population stabilization policies, family planning, maternal health, rural health, and literacy, these programs so much. Particularly states in central India, like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and so on. So in these states, the fertility rate is almost twice that of the Indian average. So these are the, you could say, the ticking time bomb, so to speak. And these states will create more, add to our high levels of poverty, people being born in poverty. This will continue in the foreseeable future unless we seriously take steps to address this problem, to champion family planning, non-controversial, non-coercive family planning. But once again, because of the history of controversy associated with family planning, most political leaders, they don't want to touch that, unfortunately. So this is a very wicked problem. Perhaps there is no solution to that. Another question on animal farming. The concept of animal farming. Animal farming is just a broad term for any kind of livestock, any kind of livestock, keeping and growing any kind of livestock, whether it is for dairy, for milk, for meat, eggs, any kind of animal breeding, any kind of animal farming is, broadly here. The traditional way of doing it was, where animals would roam about in the pasture, and then the cows would come, you would milk the cows, or the hens would come and lay the eggs, and you would take the eggs and so on. But in the name of efficiency, in the name of large scale production, large scale low cost production, in the name of efficiency, small scale traditional types of farms have been increasingly become obliterated and taken over by large scale factory farms, large businesses where millions of chicken, thousands of cows or pigs or sheep are cooped up in small cages, in small sheds, and you can produce enormous amounts in a very relatively small plot of land, because thousands of cows are all locked up in small cages, so you don't need a lot of land. The land is elsewhere, of course. You are relying on someone else to grow feed for them somewhere else, maybe in a different country or a different state. Millions of tons of grain has to be shipped to become feed for these cows. But for the animal producer, their own land footprint is very small. They can produce a lot of milk or eggs or meat out of a small farm, and that is hugely profitable. So as a result, this is collectively known as factory farming. But as we noted, that it has terrible consequences, both for moral, ethical reasons as well as for practical, scientific reasons. But because it's so profitable, it is very hard to challenge. Unless governments really take a stand, unless there's a huge public outcry, and governments really take a stand that on principle we are going to restrict these types of farms, or at least have restrictions on how much you can do, put limits on them. The economics are so attractive that these factory farms have dramatically expanded. Okay. Next question is agroecology more profitable than modern mechanized farming? Interesting question. Now, we have to step back and think what profitable means. So once again, if you have, you can have private profit for yourself, for the business person, or you can think of long-term social benefits. So if you think of private profit for the business person, then of course the more damaging forms of farming are far more profitable, no doubt about it. So you are effectively strip mining the earth. If you have a large plot of land, if you have only monocultures of one, like just wheat or corn, miles and miles of corn, you have a giant machine, you pump in as much as chemicals as you like, you have a giant machine that is harvesting, you can produce a bumper enormous crop. If your time window is 10 years, 20 years, you can strip mine and extract whatever value you can, and then you make a big profit and you move on. So we have to step back and think what profit means. So if we think of growing food as just a matter of private profit, then we are all going to suffer in the long term. We have to, because this is so important for humanity, that we cannot afford to think of growing food as just a matter of personal private profit. We have to think of long-term social benefit. So a more sustainable farm is of course going to be less profitable than the model I just described. But over the long term, overall social benefits will be maintained. Soil fertility will be maintained, biodiversity will be maintained, clean water will be maintained, there will be less diseases, there will be improved food security for the poor. All these benefits, which are very important for society, will be maintained over the long term. Okay, we have another question on animal farming. It's a long question. Let me take a minute to read it. Okay. I think this question is a repetition of the two questions we have already answered. We already talked about dairy. So when we talked about animals, livestock, cattle, we talked about both in the question answer session. We also in the main talk we did not, but somebody did ask this question and I responded during the QA session that yes, dairy and meat, dairy, eggs, all of it is included in when we talk about livestock as a whole. And second question is also about population, which we also just, another person had that question, which exactly this question we just answered, that India's population is slowing down. The rate of growth is slowing down, but it's still going to grow for many decades. Oh, it will overtake China. And unfortunately, because of our past history in the 70s, population control has become controversial politically. So political leaders don't want to touch that subject. So unfortunately, it is unlikely that we will be able to make a very significant effort in that direction. We just have to live with what we have. We will have to try to manage with what we have. Even if we cross 1.5 billion very soon, we'll just have to figure out how to provide food, shelter, basic needs, water, jobs. So that's the situation we are stuck with.
I think, Professor, we have answered all the question and we are running short of the time. So,
okay. So if we have gone through all the questions, should we just say good evening to everyone?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So thank you for listening. I don't know how many people listen. I see like 15 to 20 people, I guess, 15 to 25, something like in that range. And I was very impressed with your questions. It shows two things. It shows that first of all, you have listened carefully, and secondly, you have paid attention and you have asked very engaging questions, which means that you are engaging with the topic, not just listening. You're engaging with the topic. And finally, many of you seem to be already well informed about not just the issues that we cover directly, but also the side issues, because the way you are asking questions, like for example, the second generation biofuel questions, shows that you are already aware of all these interrelated issues, which I have not necessarily had time to cover in the lecture. So it was a great pleasure offering this webinar, and we hope to engage again in the future. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. If you wish to seek some handouts with respect to this webinar, which was on Feed the World while preserving the ecosystem, you can write either to me on nmishra@jgu.edu.in, or you could write it to Professor Abhijit on the email ID, which is Abhijit.
Yes.
Abhijit@jgu.edu.in, and you spell Abhijit as ABHIJIT.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.